Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me again and welcome to the beginning of a new week for afternoon tea in Psalm 119 on this public holiday, Freedom Day and lockdown. Oxymoron? Maybe. But it's great to have you with us this afternoon. We are going to pick it up today, Psalm 119, from verses 81 through to 88. And you may or may not have realised this, but this is actually the centre of this psalm. It's a really long psalm, but this is the middle stanza. And it's really interesting, but Charles Spurgeon, when he was writing on this, said that this stanza is the midnight of the psalm, as he put it. These verses are a lament, and that language should be familiar with us if you've been joining us for Church at Home, as we are 2 weeks down in our 3-week series on Lamentations. So you're going to see a lot of stuff in this stanza that you might have been learning as we've gone through church over the last couple of weeks. And of course, in the situation in our country, in our world at the moment, this is the perfect time for a lament. So let's pick it up at verse 81. Verse 81, the beginning of the stanza, really sums up the conflict of lament for the Christian. My soul faints with longing for your salvation, but I have put my hope in your word. You see, there's that great honesty and yet still real faith. He struggles, he longs, his soul faints. When, Lord, will you come and set things right? This is not okay. But at the same time, in the very same breath, an expression that he still keeps his hope in God's word. So honest, so down to earth. And have a listen in the first 4 verses of this stanza to his experience. Verse 81, my soul faints. In other words, the psalmist is almost ready to give up. Verse 82, my eyes fail looking for your promise. In other words, he's saying, God, I can't see how your promise and my pain are meant to make sense together. I can't see. I'm really struggling. And then verse 83, though I'm like a wineskin in the smoke, I do not forget your decrees. Now that metaphor's a little bit lost on me. Maybe a South African equivalent is like, my pup suck is empty and I've thrown it in the trash. I'm not sure. But I think the idea is that he's dried up and he's burnt out. He's got nothing left. And yet the second half of each of those lines show us that he's still hanging in there. This opening of this stanza expresses both the struggle and the conviction of the person who has put their faith in God through a hard time. Have a look at verse 84. This is the question of his lament. And it's a great question. He says, how long must your servant wait? When will you punish my persecutors? Now, in this psalm, it doesn't seem like he gets an answer to the question. But lament isn't about seeking the answer in nearly as so much as it is relating to God in this moment of hardship. And verse 84 sums up his question. The second half of the psalm, of the stanza rather, the next 4 verses tell us why he's feeling like that. Have a look at verse 85. The arrogant digs a pit to trap me. And then verse 87, he says, they almost wipe me from the earth, but I have not forsaken your precepts. So the poor guy's under attack, and he's really struggling with that. But yet wedged between the description of his oppressors is verse 86. All your commands are trustworthy, and help me because I'm being persecuted without cause. You see, when people reject God's word, they will inevitably persecute God's people. It's the way that the pattern continues. People reject God. The very next thing is they will turn to those who stand for God, and then they would start taking pot shots at them too. And you might have already felt that. You might have felt that personally in a relationship. Someone has pulled away from you or even gone quite aggressive towards you because of your faith in Jesus. Maybe it's institutionally. Maybe it's even on a national level. It can be really within any context. But the bottom line is, and what our psalmist is experiencing, is that when people reject God's word, they will, before too long, inevitably turn and start to persecute God's people. And so his request here at the end of the stanza is in verse 88, "In your unfailing love, preserve my life." That's he's asked some questions. This is now his request in his lament. Now, when my NIV says in your unfailing love, that's the same as steadfast love. And we might have talked about it before, touched on this. That's the idea, that great Hebrew word hesed. It's covenant love. It's not just God's affection for his people, but it's God's promise. It's God's declaration, the covenant that he has made. And so here the psalmist doesn't appeal on God's mercy, although he could have. He appeals to the promise that God has made. Not to what he'd like God to do for him, but for what he knows God has already said he will do. He's saying, God, be faithful, be true to your covenant love that you have made with your people. And I know I can ask this with full confidence. Preserve my life. That's not an unreasonable request, and that is a request that is in keeping with the will of God because he has revealed his promise in his covenant. He's claiming a promise that he knows he can count on, even when his whole world is collapsing in around him. Well, I think this is a fantastic stanza. I found it a huge encouragement personally. It reminds us from beginning to end that the Christian life is full of these kind of tensions. The tensions of verse 81, 82, 83. My soul faints, my eyes fail, I'm dried out, and yet I've put my hope in your word. I still speak to you. I don't forget your decrees. That's the tension of the Christian life. If you're feeling that, it's not because there's something wrong with your faith. It's because your faith is working hard and is being a real blessing to you in times of struggle. It's a little bit like Paul's experience in the New Testament in 2 Corinthians, and I wanted to read that to you now as we close. This is a great parallel passage to our stanza from Psalm 119. You might like to say this is a New Testament expression of those Old Testament words. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, picking it up at verse 7. Paul says, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." And then skipping to verse 16, "Therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." Well, I hope these words have been a real help to you today and maybe a really nice companion piece for our short journey through Lamentations on a Sunday. Right, well, for tomorrow you can read ahead and pick up from verse... No, actually not 105. I actually need to go back. I skipped a part that I wanted to do at the end of last week. And fortunately with Psalm 119 you can do that. You can read a stanza as it suits you. And so if you'll forgive my isolation brain that I missed something I wanted to cover last week, let's just go back for tomorrow. Let's go back to verse 73, just the stanza before, because there's some gold there that I really don't want us to miss. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.